Everyone, thank you very much for joining our webinar about introduction to cloud remediation and cloud remediation. My name is Dor Zusman. I'm the Director of Technology Strategy at Dazz. It's a pleasure being here. And I might just kick things off. If you have any questions, feel free to submit using the system. I'll try to answer them to the best of my ability. And if you want to continue this conversation, we are always open to talk about this kind of subject. So we are available over email, LinkedIn, whatever platform you want to communicate through. I'm always happy to discuss this kind of things. Cool. So I'll kick things off. So a little bit of background about me. I came from almost 10 years of experience in vulnerability research, penetration testing, etc. And the topic I'm here to talk about today is cloud remediation, right? And I thought what a better way to start doing that, just going over some cyber security events from a random week, right? So this is a random week in 2021. I picked out the headlines, and you can see in those headlines that I just selected like 3 major headlines here. So we have like the GoDaddy incident, which was in about 2021. GoDaddy, which is the world's largest domain registrar and web host by market share, they were attacked, right? And they reported in their SEC filing that an unknown party used a compromised password and got access to some legacy system they have, right? And they managed to access over 1 million user accounts, which is quite like, it's a big breach. It was very talked in the time. I remember it as like, it made headlines all around, right? We're looking at a similar breach here at HP Enterprise. And they said in a statement that an unauthorized person used a private key to gain access to customer data stored in their Aruba Central Cloud, which is a subsidiary of HP. They did not mention exactly how the hacker obtained access to this private key, but they said the key allowed access to cloud servers and multiple regions where the customer data was stored, right? And if you look at even California Pizza Kitchen, right, they had like a similar incident, a data breach, and they lost like a lot of employees' social security numbers, right? So just a random week in 2021, we're seeing data breaches. Most of them are around like key management, circuit management, stuff like that. That's kind of the motive here from this random sampling. So I thought like it would be probably fun to go back in time and look 3 years earlier at the exact same week in November, right? So I just did that. I went back 3 years back, like this is 2018, exact same week in November. And we're seeing this is actually the week that Marriott was reported that it was breached, right, in November 2018, which again was a big deal at the time, right? And the breach was like, it was believed to have begun back in 2014 in Starwood, which is a company that Marriott acquired, and they inherited their security flaws. They had some database open to the internet with Telnet and RDP connections open, and their entire reservation system was compromised doing that. So it was believed back in the time that the attacker lived in Starwood for quite some time, and when the acquisition happened, they gained access to Marriott, to the entire Marriott infrastructure, right? So this was a big headline. You can see like customer data stolen, exclamation mark, right? Like it was big at the time. It was, I think, all the big newspapers all around the world. We're seeing a similar breach. Actually, Dell didn't really share at the time a lot of details, but they just reported they suddenly noticed attacker communication around their infrastructure and they shut it down. So again, and Uber had like a big data breach at the time. So we're looking at like pretty similar in concept headlines, right? Like there is a data breach, a big enterprise is impacted by it, and 3 years have passed and we're seeing basically the same headlines. So it's actually, we're looking at the same story, right? Like there is a simple attack here. We're not talking about like an APT group, some sophisticated attack threat actors, something like that. We're talking about like simple usage of unsecure password, misconfigurations, firewall rules open to the internet, right? The stuff that we all know about. And that's on the one hand. On the other, we're looking at like unproportional business impact, right? Like Marriott suffered from that breach in damages almost $1 billion, right, in shareholder damage, which is a lot of money, right? And they had headlines like this, like Marriott hotel hack impacts all of the customers. Are you one of them? All over the place for like a week or a couple of weeks, right? And that has like business implications of itself as well. So I think like, why is that? Why can we see the same old story, the same simple attacks keep like defeating the big enterprises, the big companies, right? So this is kind of what I wanted to talk about today. And I think that's a good way to kind of start into it, which is remediation is an interesting story, right? And it's not as trivial as one would think. So here is a tweet I really like from Jeremiah Grossman, who is doing security strategy for a long time for a lot of very successful companies. He did it in SentinelOne. Now I believe it's doing it in Tenable. And in this tweet, he's kind of capturing all of the cybersecurity companies in various spaces, and he's asking like humorously, are we secure yet, right? Like, do we have enough companies? Because simple attacks should have simple solutions, right? Someone must have already thought about a solution, and the market is full with comprehensive detection tools that do exactly that. They connect to your environment, they detect threats. Simple threats like an overprivileged key or an old passwords that needs refreshing, right up to very, very complicated risks like vulnerable code dependencies, SCA scanners, right? And from enterprise security companies to very young startups, you have a ton of options to take your pick in detection tools and really, really be good at finding the specific risk you are scared about and you want to mitigate, right? So you had that options for some time now. I think that's the interesting part, right? Like that's not a recent picture, and there are a lot of new companies out there. There are a lot of still kicking very old, very good companies, right? So I ask again, like, what's the big deal? Why do we keep seeing that, like simple attacks with unproportional business damage? And why aren't we secure yet? I think that's my point. So I think in order to understand that, we need to kind of go into the mindset of a security engineer in one of those enterprises, right? So let's take this, right? Like let's imagine, for example, we are a security engineer in the GoDaddy incident, right? And this is an example of an alert that might come up in their AWS, for example, environment, and by one of those detection tools that we showed, right? And that's stating that basically the passwords in the AWS account needs to be changed. If we go and handle this alert, we could enforce the organization to periodically change passwords, right? So that's just the way to solve this. So why is it important to refresh passwords is, let's imagine like a threat actor gaining access to a secure password. If you keep an expiration period as low as possible on each password, you can kind of mitigate and minimize the attack window that threat actor has, right? So if a password was leaked or maybe stolen or something like that, the threat actor doesn't have a lot of time to actually use that to attack the environment. And once it's changed, you might just take that privilege away from them. And that's why it's a good policy, right? So let's put ourselves back in the mind of the security engineer and start handling this, right? So I got this alert, and now I need to understand, like, do I need to handle it, right? So that could be a duplicated alert, right? Like someone from a different team maybe, or some other tool, or maybe even myself, but just from somewhere around my detection stack, I got basically the same alert and I already handled it, right? So that's a very viable option. That happens a lot. And maybe it's just a false positive. Maybe the security tool is just misbehaving, right? And when I go and I want to actually understand this phenomenon, right, I did what every good engineer does, and I created a flowchart of something I don't understand. And we started building that flowchart in order to understand the process, right? So like, do I need to handle it? Maybe. So it could be a false positive, it could be duplicated. Let's say it's not, right? Let's say I actually need to handle it. It's not false positive, it's not duplicated. So now I need to understand prioritization, right? Like, when do I need to handle it? It might be just too complicated to dive into right now, and I have better things to do with my time. That very much tracks and makes sense, right? Maybe I just need to go and ask someone, like, should I really do it? Am I allowed to access this part of the environment? Is it under my responsibility? And maybe I just don't have the resources to deal with it right now. Maybe I have something more burning that I have to address right now. So every one of those reasons and more could cause delays. But let's say we're past that, we know all the answers, we don't want to delay. We actually want to solve this, we know we want to solve it, and we want to solve it right now, right? So then, if the decision is right now, we need to understand, like, what is the cause of this alert? If I actually am going to solve it, I need to understand where is it coming from? What do I need to fix, right? Is it a configuration I need to change? Is it code I need to change or maybe redeploy? Is it infrastructure as code, which is a different type of configuration but needs to solve in a very different way? So, like, exactly what is the root cause of this alert is a hard technical question to ask, especially in large environments and especially in enterprises environments where the environment is really, really complex and really, really dynamic. You can have dozens and hundreds of developers changing code, changing the environment on a daily basis. Understand exactly where that change came from is not an easy task, right? So let's say I actually did it, right? Like, I found the root cause, and now I know where I need to fix it. I know I want to fix it, and I know I want to fix it now. So now I need to understand, like, who exactly is responsible for this alert, or a different way of asking this is, like, who is responsible for this specific piece of the environment, right? I can't just go and change under the hood they working on this environment, right? Like, they need this environment. It could be business critical, it could be production. I can't really go and change configuration without talking to the person who owns this. So I need to understand who is responsible. I can go and ask around, I can probe any organizational systems I have, Slack them, email them, find the person, and then if I find a person and they tell me kind of like, nah, you're looking at the wrong person, this is actually who I need to talk to, that ping pong goes and happens in like, it takes time, right? So let's say I did all that, right? Like, I managed to decide I want to handle it. I want to handle it right now. I know the root cause. I know the person who owns this. And now I'm sitting down with them and I'm trying to actually remediate that, right? So how do I even remediate that? I need to understand, like, maybe I know the fix. Maybe I know what configuration change or code change is needed here. Maybe I need to ask around and start asking, like, how do you redeploy that part of the environment? How do you fix that specific piece of code? Who is the owner of this specific type of library I'm using? Maybe I need to Google because the alert is kind of complicated and I've yet to see something like this, right? So everything can happen when I try to remediate, and the worst thing is that I can break production, right? I can break running code, I can break business critical stuff, then I need to revert back and try to understand again, how do I remediate that? That cycle takes time and effort, right? It's not easy. And when I finally do, I can finally say, like, I remediated that alert, right? So if we look at that flowchart and that story and we kind of zoom back to a high level view of it, we understand very important two things, right? So the first thing is we shouldn't have tried to do that flowchart, right? It doesn't translate well over the screen. It's very, very complicated and it's not understandable. But that's kind of the second point, right? It is a complicated process. It's not as easy as one would imagine, just changing passwords, right? So let's say we did all that. We ran through the flowcharts and we're finally remediated that issue. So that usually, from our experience, takes between 2 days and 2 months, depends on the type of the alert and depends on the type of the environment and the experience of the engineer. But let's say we did it, problem solved, right? But wait a minute, that's not probably the only alert I have to deal with today. And there is a reason the cloud environment is kind of a field by itself, right? So, like, there is a lot of nooks and crannies that you need to get familiar with, a lot of decisions to be made across that policies, and it's not the only alert, right? So that alert is probably buried in a very, very long backlog of all the alerts that I got in my environment from all across my detection stack, from all across my environments, cloud providers, on-prem environments, like SaaS providers. All of that accumulates into a lot of noise and a lot of data that I need to sift through and try to understand exactly how am I going to solve this. And this photo is actually pretty neat. That's a word cloud we actually generated from a couple of environments we looked at, right? And the scale of the policy, like the scale of the font you see here, is the actual, it's the amount of times we've seen that in the environment, right? In a couple of environments. So you see here a lot of repetitive alerts, a lot of alerts that are less understandable than just like refresh the password, right? And a lot of stuff that you need to go into understand, like the business implications of it, and maybe it's intended to do that. Like remediation doesn't have to be like a fix. It could be just we know the risk and we accept it, right? So that could be a whole bunch of things that causes delay, and that's why it's kind of hard finding the needle in the haystack here and actually getting to a point where you remediate the critical issue that an attacker is going to exploit, right? And attackers are not like defenders in the sense that attackers just need one doorway to go into, and a defender needs to barricade the entire bank, right? It's not as easy task on both sides. So just missing one that is very critical, that's all a threat actor actually needs, right? Versus when a defender needs to look at that huge amount of data and actually reconcile what's my next step and what's my most prioritized step, which is sometimes even a harder question. So that's exactly the story of remediation, right? And that's why we started the company, basically, right? So that's just the reality organizations live in today. Detections are just off the charts. There are a lot of detection tools all around. They're all creating a bunch of detections, a bunch of noise. Sometimes there is good signal, sometimes there is bad. But remediation just can't keep pace with the overwhelming data that you get. And the SLAs keeps pushing and the risk window keeps growing. And then an attacker just needs to find one of those that you kind of knew about already, right? But it's not really fair to say that you knew about it and you could have fixed it. So that's what we keep seeing. Security teams are handled and usually have too many alerts. It's really hard to assess and prioritize. They have no visibility to the development environment itself, and that creates problems by itself. Just doing that triage, finding who is the owner, what is the root cause. It's really, really hard to find the owner of an issue. And sometimes fixes are manual, and sometimes it happens all across the environment in a way it's just repeating and the issues reoccur, right? And we are seeing an impact on just the risk window keeps growing, right? So that's exactly what we do, and our kind of solution to that is to be able to reduce all that signal into just the actions you need to perform in your environment in order to solve the issue, right? So here is an example case study. There was a company we connected to during the Log4j incident, right? And they have 17,000 containers vulnerable running in production, right? And that's like a vast amount. And you can imagine every container raising maybe one alert on a detection tool. Maybe they have duplicative detection tools, right? We're talking about a very big number of alerts that you need to sift through. But once you get to the technical side of it, once you understand how code actually reached there, you know that all of those vulnerable containers are actually coming from like 600 and something affected container images, right? Those images are actually coming from 100 and something Docker files that the fix should be within them, right? And those Docker files are actually owned by about 40 developers, right? So now you can create a burn list and start actionizing on it, and it seems much more reasonable to actually tackle such a big impact in your environment in such a way, right? So that's kind of the pivot we allow, focusing on how you solve it and on the solution rather than the signal, right? So the way we do it is relatively simplistic, but it does come from our understanding of the issue, right? So our understanding of the issue is that when you have like that knowledge, that deep knowledge of root cause analysis, we call it, like finding who is the owner, what is the fix, you can actually, by doing that, you can actually reduce the amount of work just to that fix, and you see that impact in production environments, right? So usually what we do is we connect to the environment, right? So we connect to the CI/CD, the code, and we map out how code actually reaches production. Once we do, we can actually understand how that code came into being, all of the SDLC parts that created it, right? And once you have an alert for, let's say, in the cloud, in the CI, in the code, we actually can trace it back to the root cause. And what we find while doing that is just doing that, just pivoting from looking at the signal of the detection tools and looking at the root cause actually allows us to reduce the root cause almost sometimes by 90%, just shrinking the backlog, right? Which is very, very effective when you want to focus it, right? So instead of getting just a backlog of issues, you get a list of stuff you need to do, right? A list of fixes and their impact in production. And once we know that, we can give the fix with the context to the right person using the organizational system that you use, right? Like we believe that we should meet the developers where they are, right? We don't have to enforce developers using different systems. We don't want to create traction the other way around. We want to create adoption. We want to incite ownership and responsibility around security. And the way to do that is by communicating in a very effective way, just giving the developers an effective way to fix without having to sift through the signal of the detection tool, right? Like imagine talking to a developer and just have at hand automatically attached to a fix ticket, like this is the code that you need to change. This is how we recommend changing it. This would be the impact on your security backlog if you do that, right? So that's a whole different conversation. And that's it. Most of our solution, all of our solution is connected using read-only API access, right? Like we don't have to change anything. We're a SaaS solution. We're very, very, we very much believe in the approach that we shouldn't be an active part of the environment, just an observer in a way that we can enable remediation but not put anything at risk. So that's why everything is read-only, except of course from ticketing and stuff like that we have to, but that's kind of the point of our solution, right? To actionize remediation in a way that's very seamless to the enterprise. It doesn't require a lot of setting up, a lot of friction with developers and stuff that we've seen in previous lives, right? So I think that's it. That's all I had to say. I hope you found that interesting or useful or at least entertaining for a bit. And I'll take any questions you have if you have any. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions. It was a pleasure being here. Thank you very much for your time. If you want to contact me directly, you can do it by contacting Zusi, Z-U-S-I at Dazz.io or just visit our site. That's it. Have a great day. Thank you for being here.